Fast Start, Test Complete, Module 9, Checkpoints. So in the previous module we created our first keyword tests. We looked at the concept of adding test steps to that test using the keyword driven drag and drop GUI based approach to building tests and the record capability within TestComplete. We saw how those tests can be grouped into a project, and that project may have multiple instances of the same test case. They're grouped in the project, and then the project as a whole can be run and each individual test is executed in turn. Those projects then are then grouped into the project suite, and we can execute the project suite which calls each of the individual projects in turn. But all of this counts for nothing unless we have checkpoints or expected results that we use to check and confirm the validity of the test steps after they've been executed. And as we've mentioned in passing, this concept is called checkpoints in TestComplete, and it's the implementation and the creation of those checkpoints that gives us the equivalent of our manual test cases where we have an expected result and an actual result, and that comparison results in a pass or a fail status. Those checkpoints are created within the test cases themselves, and when the test case is run we get a log file, and that log file will have the checkpoints displayed, where it'll either be a pass or a fail depending on the comparison of the actual and expected results. So in this particular example we had an actual value 25 dot space and we had an expected value of 25 dot space. The comparison condition was an equals, and the result was that was a pass as the two were equivalent. So in this module we're going to look at the concept of checkpoints in a little more detail, because in fact whilst we've only seen a property checkpoint so far, there is a range of different checkpoints within TestComplete, and those include checkpoints to do file comparisons, object comparisons, XML comparisons, and all manner of other different types of comparisons and checks. Now there are a number of ways to create those checkpoints. We've created a test case here called our checkpoint test, and one way we can create those checkpoints is to drag the checkpoint from the operations panel over onto the test case. So if we wanted to create a property checkpoint again, drag that across to the test, and TestComplete presents us with the property checkpoint wizard. The concept of creating a checkpoint is that we need to identify the object we want to look at and create the checkpoint for. So we may drag the crosshair to a text box, and once we've identified the object that we want to create the checkpoint for, click on the next button and we identify the property of that object that we want to do the comparison for. So in this case, wText property, currently that's set to 0 dot space. The next step then is we want to identify the value that we want to set for the comparison. So in the previous screen we saw that it was currently set to 0 dot space, but if we want to modify that so that after we've done our test steps we're looking for 10 dot space, then we can change that expected value here. We can also set the condition, so there are other condition operators here we can use if we need to, and we can just validate that we've selected the right object and we've selected the right property. Click on the finish button and we've created our property checkpoint. Now the key point to highlight here is that the property checkpoint is the only checkpoint where all of the details are stored within the test step. So if we click on the On the test step here, in the value field, what we'll see is all of those settings that we just specified, they're all defined within this value field within the test step. All of the other checkpoints, the expected results, so object checkpoint, file, XML, table, etc., all of the others will have the expected results saved in the TestComplete stores. So for property checkpoint, expected results stored in the test step. For all of the other checkpoints, the expected results are saved in the stores, and we'll see how we do that and how those expected results are saved in there in a second. So what we'll do now is we'll have a look at the file checkpoint, the object checkpoint, and the region checkpoint, as these are some of the most common checkpoints we'll use. So we've seen how to create those checkpoints by dragging them onto the test workspace. The other way we can create those checkpoints is when we're doing a recording. So if we do a record append to test, record and add to the end of it, the TestComplete recording bar that we see has a drop down menu that allows us to select the checkpoint during recording. So if we create an object checkpoint, TestComplete goes through the same wizard. It expects us to identify the object. So let's identify the 7 button in this instance. TestComplete confirms that we've selected the object. We get an image to confirm that. Click on the next button, and this time what we want to do is either retrieve the data from the object or use stored object data. So this allows us to use existing data about the object if we've already saved it, or save the data to a new object entry in the store, which is what we'll do now by selecting this option. So we'll store the selected object data. We won't store the child objects in this instance, just store the object itself. And in storing that object, TestComplete wants to know all of the properties that we want to store as part of that baseline for the object. So we can in fact add different properties in here, but what we want to do is select some sensible properties, so that the caption is 7, that it's visible on the screen, that it's enabled, ID may stay static, and the screen position, well, that's probably changed depending on where the window is, so we'll take that one out. But when we finish that, what we'll see when we stop the recording is that TestComplete adds a new object to the stores object. So you can see here our button 71, and all the comparison data for our rerun for that object is now stored within the TestComplete store objects entity. And the test step in the test case makes reference to that object and the data we've stored in the store, because the object checkpoint does not save that information in the test step, it saves it in the store. So the reference here to BTN71, which is the object reference in here, and the checkpoint here is carried out with the expected results from the store against the object that's listed in the value column here. So that's the object checkpoint. We can do a similar thing for a file checkpoint. So if we drag the file checkpoint in, TestComplete expects us to specify a file name. So we can pick out a file name, and again this is our expected results that we'll do the comparison against. Click next. We'll save a baseline of that file in our store. We can specify some allowed tolerances in bytes, and when we click finish, we'll see that under the files node here that we've saved the baseline or the expected results for that file comparison. in the test itself, we'll see in here that we've got a reference for this checkpoint to the file in the store, and we'll be looking to compare against that file on the file system when we rerun the test. So the last checkpoint we'll look at then is the region checkpoint, and this is an image checkpoint effectively, so we can specify a region of the object we want to check. So I could drag that to the Calculator Plus application, select the whole object. The wizard confirms that we've selected the correct object and the name of that object. And if we click on next, again we capture an image of that object. It's saved in the store. Then we can specify some tolerances in terms of pixel differences or color tolerance. And when we click on next, we get one final dialog box which allows us to put in a comparison mask. So maybe we want to add a comparison mask which allows us to mask out parts of that image we don't want to compare. So if I zoom in here, what we could say is, let's mask out the answer text box there, so that when we do the image comparison, it will compare everything except the area that we've masked out. Now both the mask and the image itself are now stored in the regions component of the store. So you can see here we've got the mask and we have the image of the Calculator Plus that we want to do the comparison against. In the test itself, we've got a reference to a region checkpoint, and we have a reference to the image in the regions area of the store, and in here we have a reference to the mask that we want to apply when we do that comparison as well. So just out of interest then, if we run the test here, if we click on run test, it'll run all 4 of those checkpoints against the application, and we can then evaluate and see the results that TestComplete has got from the expected and actual comparison results. So in this instance, if we look through the log file, what we'll see is that 1 checkpoint failed and 3 passed. First one failed because the expected results we set was 10 dot space and the actual result was 0 dot space, so there was a invalid comparison here. But the other 3 checkpoints, the object checkpoint, every property in that checkpoint compared favourably, the file checkpoint passed because the files were the same, and the region checkpoint passed because the images were the same. So to summarise that then, the main checkpoints that you're going to be finding yourself using when you're creating your expected results within your tests are the file checkpoint, which will compare text files, the object checkpoint, which will store the properties of an object you want to do a comparison on, the property checkpoint, which compares just one property of an object that you've selected, and the region checkpoint, which compares images of an application or an object within that application. Other checkpoints that we don't go into here but you may want to do some research on is a database, so we can connect to a database and do table checkpoints. We can do HTML table checkpoints, web services using SOAP connections to APIs, and there's also an XML checkpoint which will allow us to diff and compare XML files. If you're ever curious about which checkpoint you should be using, you can always call upon the checkpoint wizard, and when you enter that onto your test, TestComplete will take you through a wizard which asks you some questions and then suggests the most appropriate checkpoint for your particular need. So in conclusion then, we've seen 4 of the key checkpoint types within TestComplete. You've seen 2 ways to create those checkpoints, either by dragging them from the operations panel into your test, or using the recording menu bar when you do a recording. And we've seen how the results from those checkpoints are displayed in our log files after the test execution.